In the darkest corners of military history, some names are whispered with fear, others with respect. But, when Admiral Marcus Steele heard the name Iron Ghost echo through the secure communication channel that cold October morning, something unprecedented happened. A man who had commanded thousands of elite Navy SEALs, who had stared down international terrorists and survived 3 tours in the most dangerous waters on Earth, went completely silent. For 37 seconds, the most decorated SEAL admiral in modern history couldn't speak. The operations room fell dead quiet. Veterans who had seen him face impossible odds watched as their unshakable commander's face drained of color. Because Marcus Steele knew something the rest of the world didn't. The Iron Ghost wasn't just a legend. The Iron Ghost was someone he thought he had buried 23 years ago. The call had come from deep within enemy territory, from a voice that shouldn't exist, carrying a message that would force Admiral Steele to confront the most classified mission of his career. A mission so secret that even the president didn't know the full truth. A mission that had supposedly ended with one of the greatest tragedies in special operations history. But, the dead don't usually call to ask for extraction. What happened next would challenge everything the military establishment believed about loyalty, sacrifice, and the true cost of serving in the shadows. Because sometimes, the ghosts we create come back to haunt us in ways we never expected. And, sometimes, they come back to save us all. Admiral Marcus Steele had always prided himself on being unshakable. In his 32 years of military service, he had seen things that would break most people. He had led rescue missions in hurricane-battered seas, commanded operations in the most hostile territories on Earth, and made decisions that determined whether his men came home alive or in flag-draped coffins. His hands had never trembled, his voice had never wavered, and his resolve had never cracked. Until that Tuesday morning when the secure phone on his desk rang with a call that shouldn't have been possible. The operations center at Naval Special Warfare Command buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Intelligence analysts hunched over glowing screens, processing satellite feeds from 12 different global hotspots. Communications specialists managed encrypted channels that connected SEAL teams scattered across 4 continents. The massive wall displays showed real-time positions of naval assets, weather patterns, and threat assessments that painted a complex picture of American military presence around the world. Marcus sat at the center of it all, reviewing mission reports that had arrived overnight. 3 successful extractions in the Mediterranean, a weapons cache discovery in Southeast Asia, and routine patrol updates from teams operating in the Arctic Circle. Standard operations for men who made the impossible look routine. The secure line's distinctive chirp cut through the background noise. Marcus glanced at the incoming call display, expecting to see a familiar designation from one of the active operational theaters. Instead, the screen showed something that made him blink hard and look again. Origin, classified authentication, Phantom Protocol designation, unknown. Phantom Protocol hadn't been used in over 2 decades. It was a communication standard reserved for the most sensitive operations, the kind that existed in the gray spaces between official military doctrine and absolute deniability. Marcus had helped design the protocol himself, back when he was a young lieutenant commander working on what the Pentagon euphemistically called special access programs. He picked up the handset, his training keeping his voice steady despite the questions flooding his mind. "This is Admiral Steele." Static filled the line for several seconds, the kind of interference that suggested the call was being routed through multiple secure relays, probably bouncing off satellites positioned over international waters before finding its way to his desk. Then, through the electronic noise, came a voice that stopped his heart. "Hello, Admiral. It's been a long time." The voice was different, rougher, weathered by years and circumstances Marcus could only imagine. But the cadence was unmistakable, the slight pause before consonants, the way certain vowels carried just a hint of the Boston accent that military training had never quite erased. It was a voice from a ghost story, from a classified file that officially didn't exist, from a mission that had ended with a memorial service attended by people who couldn't speak the dead man's real name. Marcus felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. His free hand gripped the edge of his desk hard enough to turn his knuckles white. Around him, the operations center continued its normal rhythm, oblivious to the fact that their commander was experiencing something that challenged the very foundations of reality as he understood it. "That's impossible," Marcus whispered into the handset, his voice barely audible even to himself. I know how it sounds, the voice replied, and now Marcus could hear something else beneath the familiar tones: exhaustion, pain, and something that might have been desperation. But I need you to listen carefully, because I don't have much time, and there are people who very badly want to make sure this conversation never happens. The line crackled with interference, and Marcus realized his hand was shaking slightly as he held the phone. He forced himself to focus, drawing on decades of training that had prepared him for every conceivable crisis except this one. "Prove it," he said, his voice regaining some of its command authority. "Tell me something only he would know." A pause, then, a sound that might have been bitter laughter. "You remember that night in Coronado, 3 weeks before the mission? You were having nightmares about the Carney incident, and you couldn't sleep. You found me on the beach at 0300, and I told you about my sister Sarah. About how she used to have night terrors after our father died, and how I learned that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is just sit with them in the dark." The memory hit Marcus like a physical blow. The conversation had taken place 23 years ago, on a moonless night when the weight of command had felt heavier than usual. He had never mentioned that conversation to another soul, had never included it in any report or debriefing. It existed only in his memory and in that of the man who officially died 6 months later on a mountainside in Afghanistan. James. Marcus breathed the name into the phone, and saying it aloud felt like crossing a line from which there could be no return. "I go by different names now," the voice replied. "But, yeah, it's me. And, Marcus, I'm in serious trouble. The kind of trouble that's going to spill over onto a lot of innocent people if I don't get some help." Marcus looked around the operations center, suddenly aware of how many people could potentially overhear this conversation. He activated the privacy screen around his workstation and switched the call to his personal secure line, one that recorded everything but stored the recordings in a vault that only he could access. "Where are you?" he asked. "Eastern Europe. I can't be more specific over this channel, but I'm going to send you coordinates through a back channel we set up years ago. Do you remember the protocol?" Marcus did remember. It was a communication method they had developed during the planning stages of Operation Nightfall, a way to pass information that bypassed normal intelligence channels entirely. At the time, it had seemed like an unnecessary precaution. Now, it felt like a lifeline. "I remember," he confirmed. "But, James, you need to understand officially, you died in that operation. There was a funeral. There's a star on the wall at Langley with your name on it. As far as the world knows, you've been dead for 23 years. "I know exactly what the official record says," came the reply, and Marcus could hear a new edge in the voice. "I helped write most of it. But the mission didn't end the way we reported it, and there are consequences from that night that are still playing out. People are dying, Marcus. Good people who don't deserve what's coming for them." "What kind of consequences?" The line went quiet for so long that Marcus wondered if the connection had been lost. Then, James spoke again, and his words sent ice through the Admiral's veins. "Do you remember what we were really doing in Afghanistan? Not the cover story, not the version that went in the official reports. The real mission." Marcus closed his eyes and let himself remember. Operation Nightfall had been sold to the Pentagon as a straightforward intelligence-gathering mission, a chance to infiltrate a Taliban training camp and document their activities. But the real objective had been much more complex and infinitely more dangerous. They had been hunting a man called the Architect, a mysterious figure who seemed to be coordinating attacks across multiple countries, someone with access to intelligence that should have been impossible for a terrorist to obtain. The mission had taken them deep into the mountains along the Pakistan border, following a trail of breadcrumbs that had led them to a compound that officially didn't exist. "I remember," Marcus said quietly. "The Architect wasn't who we thought he was," James continued. "And the intelligence he had access to, it wasn't stolen. It was being fed to him. By someone on our side." The implications of that statement hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. A mole, someone in the American intelligence apparatus who had been actively working to undermine operations and get people killed. The kind of betrayal that struck at the heart of everything they had sworn to protect. We thought we had identified the source, Marcus said, remembering the briefings that had taken place in secure rooms beneath the Pentagon. The investigation was supposed to continue after the mission. The investigation died with me, James replied. Or rather, it died when I was reported dead. But the mole didn't die. And, for the past 23 years, he's been climbing the ranks, gaining access to more sensitive information, and selling it to whoever pays the best price. Marcus felt a cold realization settling in his stomach. You're telling me that someone in a position of significant authority in American intelligence has been a foreign asset for over 2 decades? I'm telling you it's worse than that. The mole isn't just selling information anymore. He's actively orchestrating operations designed to eliminate people who might pose a threat to his position. And, recently, he's figured out that I'm still alive. The pieces were starting to come together in Marcus's mind, forming a picture that was both terrifying and infuriating. That's why you're calling now. After all these years, something has changed. 3 weeks ago, someone tried to kill me in Prague, James confirmed. Professional hit team, the kind that doesn't miss unless something goes very wrong. I got lucky, but barely. And the intelligence they had about my location and habits was too detailed, too current. It could only have come from someone with access to the deepest levels of classified information. Marcus rubbed his temples, trying to process the magnitude of what he was being told. A mole in American intelligence, operating for decades. People dying as a result of intentional betrayal. And James, a man who should have been dead, somehow surviving in the shadows while this conspiracy played out around him. What do you need? Marcus asked. I need extraction, James replied. But, more than that, I need someone I can trust to help me expose this. Because if we don't stop him soon, the body count is going to get a lot higher. And some of those bodies are going to belong to people you care about. What do you mean? I mean, he knows about you, Marcus. He knows about our connection, about the real details of Operation Nightfall. And he's starting to clean house. The words hit Marcus like ice water. He thought about his wife, his daughter who was starting her sophomore year at Georgetown, his son who was following in his footsteps at the Naval Academy. The idea that his family might be in danger because of decisions made decades ago in a classified operation was almost unbearable. Send me the coordinates, he said, his voice carrying the authority of command. I'll figure out how to get you home. It's not going to be simple, James warned. I'm in a part of the world where American operations are heavily scrutinized, and I can't use normal extraction channels because we don't know how deep this penetration goes. It's going to require some creative thinking. Marcus was already running through possibilities in his mind, thinking about assets he could deploy without going through normal channels, people he trusted absolutely, and ways to move someone across international borders without creating a paper trail that could be traced back to him. Give me 48 hours, he said. I'll have something in place. Marcus, James's voice carried a note of urgency. There's something else you need to know. The hit team in Prague, they weren't working for a foreign government. The intelligence I gathered suggests they were hired by someone inside our own system. This isn't just about betraying secrets anymore. It's about eliminating witnesses. The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at the handset in his hand as if it might provide answers to questions he wasn't sure he knew how to ask. Around him, the operations center continued its normal activities, but everything felt different now, as if the very air had changed composition. He sat back in his chair and tried to organize his thoughts. A dead man was alive. A conspiracy that should have ended decades ago was still active. And, somewhere in the labyrinth of American intelligence, a traitor was working to eliminate anyone who might threaten his position. Marcus activated his computer terminal and began accessing files that he hadn't looked at in years, records of Operation Nightfall that were buried so deep in classified databases that most people with top-secret clearances didn't even know they existed. As he read through mission reports and intelligence assessments that brought back memories he had tried to forget, one thing became crystal clear. The war they thought they had been fighting 23 years ago had never really ended. It had just gone underground, becoming more dangerous and more personal with each passing year. And now, somehow, it had found its way back to his doorstep. Marcus picked up his secure phone and began making calls to people he trusted, people who could help him navigate the complex challenge of extracting a ghost from a place that officially didn't exist, while avoiding the attention of someone who had been playing this game longer than any of them realized. The Iron Ghost was coming home. And Marcus was beginning to understand that bringing him back might be the most dangerous mission of his career. The coordinates arrived exactly 24 hours later, embedded in what appeared to be a routine weather report from a maritime monitoring station in the Baltic Sea. To anyone intercepting the transmission, it would look like standard oceanographic data, wave heights, wind speeds, and water temperatures that shipping companies use to plan their routes. But Marcus knew how to read the hidden message, how to extract the real information from the seemingly innocent numbers. James was in Romania, specifically in the mountainous region near the border with Ukraine. It was a location that presented significant challenges for any kind of extraction operation. The area was politically sensitive, with both Russian and NATO forces maintaining a careful watch over activities in the region. Local authorities were generally cooperative with American interests, but they also had to maintain a delicate balance with neighboring countries that might not appreciate unauthorized military operations in their backyard. Marcus spent the better part of 2 days planning an approach that wouldn't trigger international incidents or leave digital footprints that could be traced back to Naval Special Warfare Command. He needed people he could trust absolutely, people who understood the concept of plausible deniability and who could operate effectively in a gray area where official channels might compromise the entire mission. The solution came to him while he was reviewing personnel files of recently retired SEAL operators. Master Chief Petty Officer Daniel Rodriguez had left active duty 6 months earlier after 20 years of distinguished service, but Marcus knew that Dan's retirement was more about escaping bureaucracy than leaving the Brotherhood behind. He lived in Virginia Beach, ran a small security consulting firm, and maintained relationships with active duty personnel who respected his judgment and discretion. More importantly, Dan had been part of the original Operation Nightfall team. He had been there the night everything went wrong, had helped write the after-action reports that officially closed the books on James Sullivan's military career. If anyone could be trusted with the truth about what really happened, it was Dan Rodriguez. Marcus drove to Virginia Beach on a Saturday morning, using his personal vehicle and taking a route that avoided toll booths and traffic cameras. Dan's office was located in a converted warehouse near the oceanfront, sharing space with a yacht maintenance company and a commercial fishing operation. It was the kind of low-key location that didn't attract attention, which was exactly what Dan intended. Marcus found him in the workshop behind his office, cleaning an M4 rifle with the methodical precision that had made him one of the most effective operators in SEAL history. Dan looked up when Marcus walked in, and his expression immediately shifted from casual greeting to alert concern. "Admiral," Dan said, setting down the cleaning rod and standing to attention. "This is unexpected." "Relax, Dan," Marcus replied, closing the door behind him and engaging the privacy lock. "This isn't an official visit. And I need to talk to you about something that officially never happened." Dan's eyes narrowed slightly, but he remained silent. He had learned long ago that when senior officers wanted to discuss things that officially never happened, it usually meant that something very real and very dangerous was about to become his problem. Marcus took a deep breath and made a decision that would change both of their lives. "I need to ask you about October 15, 2001. About what really happened on that mountain in Afghanistan." The change in Dan's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His relaxed posture disappeared, replaced by the alert readiness of a man who had just been told that an old enemy was approaching. He looked around the workshop as if checking for listening devices, then moved to a cabinet in the corner and pulled out a device that would detect electronic surveillance. "We swept the building this morning," Dan said quietly as he activated the detector. "But let me check again." While Dan performed a thorough electronic sweep of the room, Marcus reflected on how much he was about to ask of a man who had already given 20 years of his life to dangerous work. Dan had earned his retirement, earned the right to run his small business and enjoy a relatively normal life with his wife and teenage daughter. But sometimes, the past had a way of demanding payment on debts that people thought had been settled long ago. "Clear," Dan announced, putting away the detector. "Now, Admiral, you want to tell me why you're asking about a mission that ended with Sullivan's death and a commendation that couldn't be publicly acknowledged?" Because James Sullivan called me 3 days ago, Marcus said quietly. And he's very much alive. Dan stared at him for a long moment, then slowly sat down on a workbench. His face had gone pale, and Marcus could see him working through the implications of what he had just been told. That's impossible, Dan said finally. I saw the body. We all did. Burned beyond recognition, but the DNA evidence was conclusive. The DNA evidence was manufactured, Marcus replied. James faked his death and has been operating under deep cover for the past 23 years. And now someone is trying to kill him. Dan rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture Marcus remembered from their time together in Afghanistan. It was what Dan did when he was processing information that challenged everything he thought he knew about a situation. Okay, Dan said slowly. Assuming that's true, and I'm not saying I believe it yet, but assuming it's true, why are you telling me? Why not handle this through official channels? Because James believes there's a mole in American intelligence, Marcus explained. Someone who has been feeding information to hostile actors for over 2 decades. Someone who was involved in the original Operation Nightfall and who now has access to high-level classified information. The color drained completely from Dan's face. You're talking about someone who was part of our command structure. Someone who knew the real objectives of the mission. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Dan stood up and began pacing the small workshop, his mind clearly working through the tactical and strategic implications. If there was a mole in the command structure during Nightfall, then everything we accomplished could have been compromised. Every operation that grew out of the intelligence we gathered, every follow-up mission, every person who was put in danger based on what we reported. It's worse than that, Marcus said. According to James, the mole has been actively working to eliminate people who might pose a threat to his position. The hit team that tried to kill James in Prague was hired by someone with access to current intelligence about his location and activities. Dan stopped pacing and turned to face Marcus. What do you need me to do? I need you to help me extract him. Quietly, without going through normal channels, and without creating a trail that can be traced back to either of us. Where is he? Marcus handed Dan a piece of paper with the coordinates. Dan studied them for a moment, then walked to a map of Eastern Europe that was mounted on the workshop wall. He traced a path from the Baltic Sea south into the Carpathian Mountains, his finger stopping at a point near the Romanian-Ukrainian border. That's not an easy area to operate in, Dan observed. Russian intelligence has a heavy presence in the region, and the local authorities are suspicious of any unusual activity. Plus, if we're talking about extracting someone who's been presumed dead for 23 years, we need to be prepared for the possibility that his appearance might raise questions we're not ready to answer. Marcus nodded. I know it's not a simple operation. But James is running out of options and time. He believes that the mole is systematically eliminating anyone who might be able to expose him. Dan studied the map for several more minutes, then turned back to Marcus. I'll need a team. People I trust absolutely, people who can operate off the books without asking too many questions. And we'll need equipment that can't be traced back to official sources. How many people? Minimum of 4, including James and me. Ideally 6. We'll need someone who speaks the local languages, someone with medical training in case James is injured, and someone who can handle electronic countermeasures. Marcus thought about the personnel requirements. Can you recommend specific people? Maybe, Dan replied. But I need to understand something first. You're asking me to put together a team for an operation that doesn't officially exist, to extract a man who's supposed to be dead, based on intelligence that suggests there's a traitor in our own command structure. If this goes wrong, it's not just our careers on the line. We could all end up in federal prison, or worse. I understand the risks, Marcus said. Do you? Dan challenged. Because I'm not sure you're thinking about this clearly. You're talking about running a covert operation on foreign soil without authorization from any official agency. You're talking about potentially compromising ongoing intelligence operations. And you're basing all of this on the word of someone who has been legally dead for 23 years. Marcus met Dan's gaze steadily. James Sullivan was one of the most capable operators I've ever known. He was also one of the most honest. If he says there's a mole, and if he says that mole is actively trying to kill people to protect his position, then I believe him. Dan was quiet for a long moment, weighing the arguments and the risks. Finally, he nodded slowly. All right. I'll help you. But we do this my way, with people I choose, and with complete operational security. No official communications, no digital trails, and no backup from official channels if things go sideways. Agreed. And if James is lying, or if he's been compromised in some way, then we abort and disappear. No heroics, no attempts to salvage the situation. We get out and never speak of this again. Marcus extended his hand. Agreed. They shook hands, and Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He was committed now, committed to a course of action that could destroy his career and potentially put innocent people in danger. But he was also committed to bringing home a man who had served his country faithfully and who deserved better than to die alone in a foreign country because of a traitor's ambition. Over the next several hours, Dan outlined his plan for assembling a team and acquiring the necessary equipment. He had contacts in the private security world, people who had left military service but who maintained the skills and discretion necessary for sensitive operations. He also had access to equipment that wouldn't be traceable to government sources, weapons and communications gear that could be acquired through legitimate commercial channels. The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. Dan would assemble a team of 4 operators, ostensibly for a training exercise with a European security company that did contract work for multinational corporations. They would travel to Romania using legitimate business visas, carrying equipment that would pass customs inspection as standard corporate security gear. Once in country, they would make contact with James using protocols established years earlier, assess his condition and the threat level, and execute an extraction that would bring him to a location where he could be safely transported back to the United States. The entire operation would take no more than 72 hours, and if everything went according to plan, there would be no evidence that American military personnel had ever been involved. What about after we extract him? Dan asked as they finalized the operational details. Assuming we get him out safely, what happens then? He can't exactly resume his old identity, and he can't stay hidden forever if there really is a mole hunting him. Marcus had been thinking about the same question. First, we get him somewhere safe where he can tell us everything he knows about the mole and the intelligence operation. Then, we figure out how to expose the traitor without compromising ongoing operations or getting more people killed. And if the mole has enough influence to cover up his activities? If the evidence James has isn't enough to bring him down? Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the implications of that possibility. Then, we find another way. Because the alternative, letting a foreign asset continue to operate at the highest levels of American intelligence, is unacceptable. Dan nodded grimly. All right. Give me 72 hours to put the team together and acquire equipment. I'll contact you when everything is in place. As Marcus drove back to Norfolk, he reflected on the magnitude of what he had just set in motion. In 72 hours, American operators would be on foreign soil, conducting an unauthorized mission to extract a man whose very existence challenged official records. It was the kind of operation that could end careers and destroy reputations if it went wrong. But, as he thought about James Sullivan, about the man he had known, about the sacrifice he had made, and about the danger he now faced, Marcus knew that he had made the right choice. Some debts could only be paid with loyalty, and some friendships demanded risks that went far beyond official duty. The Iron Ghost was coming home, whether the official world was ready for him or not. The commercial flight from Frankfurt to Bucharest carried 4 passengers who appeared to have nothing in common beyond their destination. Dan Rodriguez traveled under his real name, carrying credentials identifying him as a security consultant conducting an assessment for a multinational energy company. Sarah Chen, a former Navy corpsman whose medical training had saved lives in 3 different war zones, posed as a telecommunications specialist. Tommy O'Brien, whose expertise with electronic surveillance had made him invaluable during counter-terrorism operations in Iraq, carried papers showing him to be a systems analyst. And Jake Morrison, who spoke 7 languages fluently and could blend into almost any cultural environment, was officially an interpreter and cultural liaison. To anyone watching, they were exactly what their documents claimed: ordinary business travelers heading to Romania for routine corporate work. Their luggage contained nothing more suspicious than laptops, technical manuals, and the kind of specialized equipment that security consultants and technical specialists routinely carried across international borders. But, beneath the carefully constructed cover identities, these 4 people represented one of the most capable extraction teams that could be assembled outside of official military channels. Each had decades of experience in high-risk operations, and, more importantly, each had served under Dan Rodriguez during missions where success meant the difference between coming home alive or not coming home at all. The flight landed at Bucharest's Henri Coanda International Airport on a gray Thursday morning in late November. The 4 travelers cleared customs separately, collected their luggage without incident, and left the airport using different transportation methods. To any surveillance team monitoring their arrival, it would appear that they had no connection to each other beyond coincidental timing. Dan took a taxi to a hotel in the old city center, choosing a location that was popular with business travelers and provided the kind of anonymous environment where unusual activity wouldn't attract attention. Sarah rented a car and drove to a smaller hotel near the university district. Tommy checked into a hostel that catered to budget travelers and technology workers. Jake found lodging in a guesthouse that served international students and cultural workers. Once they were settled, Dan activated a secure communication protocol that allowed the team to coordinate without using traceable electronic devices. The system had been developed by Tommy during his time with Naval Intelligence, and it used commercially available technology in ways that made monitoring extremely difficult for anyone who didn't know exactly what to look for. The message Dan sent was brief: package delivery scheduled for Saturday. Confirm receipt and readiness. The responses came back over the next 6 hours, each team member confirming that they had arrived safely and were prepared to proceed with the operation. More importantly, none of them reported any indication that their arrival had attracted unwanted attention from local authorities or foreign intelligence services. While his team established their positions, Dan began implementing the next phase of the plan. Using protocols that he and James had developed decades earlier, he sent a coded message through a secure channel that appeared to be routine business correspondence between energy companies. The message confirmed his arrival and provided coordinates for a meeting that would take place in 48 hours. The location James had chosen for their rendezvous was a small mountain village about 3 hours northeast of Bucharest, near the border with Moldova. It was the kind of place that saw occasional hiking tourists during the summer but was largely deserted during the late autumn months. More importantly, it was far enough from major cities and military installations to avoid the kind of surveillance coverage that might complicate their operations. Dan spent Friday conducting reconnaissance of the route they would use to reach the meeting point. He rented a second vehicle, studied maps of the local road network, and identified alternative routes that could be used if they encountered unexpected complications. He also visited several locations in Bucharest where surveillance might be a concern, using techniques designed to identify whether he was being followed by Romanian intelligence services or anyone else with an interest in his activities. Sarah used her time to establish medical support capabilities, acquiring supplies and equipment that might be needed if James had been injured during his escape from the Prague attack. Tommy set up electronic monitoring stations that would provide early warning if law enforcement or military units began moving toward their area of operations. Jake established relationships with local contacts who could provide information about road conditions, border security, and any unusual activity in the region. By Friday evening, everything was in place for the extraction operation. The team had confirmed that they could operate without detection, that their equipment was functioning properly, and that the route to the rendezvous point was clear of obvious complications. More importantly, Dan had received confirmation that James would be at the designated location at the specified time. But, as Dan reviewed the operational plan one final time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The operation had proceeded too smoothly, with none of the small complications and unexpected challenges that typically marked real-world missions. Either they were exceptionally lucky, or someone was allowing them to proceed according to their plan. Dan's concerns deepened when Tommy reported that he had detected unusual electronic activity in the Bucharest area. The signals were consistent with sophisticated surveillance equipment, the kind used by intelligence agencies for monitoring communications and tracking the movement of specific targets. The activity wasn't directed at their team specifically, but it suggested that someone with significant technical capabilities was conducting operations in the same general area. Could be coincidence, Tommy reported during their evening communication check. But the signature looks like military-grade equipment, and the pattern suggests they're looking for someone specific. Dan made the decision to accelerate their timeline. Instead of waiting until Saturday evening for the rendezvous, they would move to the mountain location early Saturday morning and conduct additional reconnaissance before making contact with James. If someone was indeed hunting for their target, it would be better to identify the threat before it could compromise the extraction. The drive to the mountains took longer than expected due to road construction and weather conditions that had worsened overnight. Light snow was falling by the time they reached the village where James had arranged to meet them, and visibility was reduced enough to make surveillance more difficult but also more dangerous. Dan parked his vehicle in a location that provided multiple escape routes and established a communication post in an abandoned building overlooking the main street. Sarah positioned herself at the medical aid station she had set up in a barn about half a mile from the village center. Tommy deployed his electronic monitoring equipment from a hilltop position that gave him clear sightlines in all directions. Jake took up a position near the village's only road access point, where he could provide early warning of approaching vehicles. At exactly 1,400 hours, Dan spotted a lone figure walking along the mountain trail that led to the village from the southeast. The person was moving carefully, using cover and concealment techniques that suggested military training, and appeared to be conducting counter-surveillance procedures as he approached. Through his binoculars, Dan could see that the figure was tall and lean, with the kind of efficient movement that came from decades of experience in hostile environments. As the person drew closer, Dan began to recognize features that had been familiar 23 years earlier, though they were now marked by time and hardship. James Sullivan looked older than his years, his hair completely gray and his face bearing scars that hadn't been there during his official military service. He moved with a slight limp that suggested an old injury, and Dan could see that he was carrying equipment that indicated he had been living as a fugitive for an extended period. But the eyes were unmistakable. They carried the same alert intelligence that had made James one of the most effective operators in SEAL history, and the same unwavering focus that had gotten them through situations where less prepared men would have died. Dan activated his communication system and sent a brief message to his team, "Package confirmed." Proceeding with pickup. He left his observation post and walked to the predetermined meeting location, a small coffee shop that served the few tourists who visited the village during hiking season. James was already there, sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall and a clear view of both the entrance and the rear exit. When Dan entered the shop, James looked up and nodded slightly. The recognition was mutual and immediate, despite the years that had passed and the changes that time had wrought in both men. "Hello, Dan," James said quietly as Dan approached the table. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Admiral Steele said you needed help," Dan replied, sitting down across from James and keeping his voice low. "And you were right about the surveillance. Someone is definitely looking for you." James's expression grew more serious. "How close are they?" "Unknown." Tommy detected sophisticated electronic activity in Bucharest, but we moved up our timeline and took precautions. "As far as we can tell, nobody followed us here." James was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. The fact that they're operating in Romania suggests they have significant resources. Most intelligence agencies don't deploy that kind of equipment unless they're conducting a high-priority operation. "What happened in Prague?" Dan asked. James's face darkened. Three-person team, professional-grade equipment, and intelligence about my routines that could only have come from someone with access to classified databases. They knew where I lived, where I worked, where I bought groceries. The kind of detailed surveillance that takes months to develop. "But you got away." "Barely. And only because I've been paranoid for 23 years. James reached into his jacket and pulled out a small electronic device. "I recorded everything I could about the attack, including photographs of the team members and their equipment. It's all here." Dan took the device and slipped it into his pocket. "We'll analyze it once we get you somewhere safe. But, right now, we need to move. If they were able to track you to Prague, they might be able to track you here." James nodded and stood up. "I'm ready. But, Dan, you need to understand what you're getting into. This isn't just about extracting one person. The mole I've been tracking has been compromising American operations for over 2 decades. The intelligence I've gathered could expose him, but it could also get a lot of people killed if it falls into the wrong hands." "Then, we make sure it doesn't," Dan replied. They left the coffee shop together and began walking toward the extraction point where Sarah was waiting with medical support. As they moved through the village, Dan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, despite Tommy's assurances that the electronic environment was clear. His concerns proved justified when Jake's voice came through his earpiece with a terse warning: multiple vehicles approaching from the south. Military configuration, moving fast. Dan grabbed James's arm and pulled him toward the nearest building that offered cover. "How long do we have?" he asked into his radio. "Maybe 5 minutes," Jake replied. "And there's more. Tommy's picking up radio chatter that suggests they're coordinating with air assets." James looked at Dan with an expression that mixed resignation with determination. "They found me. I don't know how, but they found me." Dan was already running through tactical options, considering escape routes and defensive positions that might give them a chance against a professional hunting team. But, as he heard the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance, he realized that they were facing a situation that would require every bit of skill and luck they could muster. The hunt for the Iron Ghost had reached the mountains of Romania, and the next few hours would determine whether he finally came home or whether he disappeared forever into the shadows that had hidden him for so long. The abandoned monastery on the hillside above the village had been built in the 14th century by monks who understood the value of defensive positions. Its thick stone walls had weathered countless storms and conflicts, and its elevated location provided clear sightlines across the valley below. For Dan Rodriguez and his team, it represented the best chance they had of surviving the next few hours. They reached the monastery with less than 3 minutes to spare, James moving with surprising agility despite his limp and the burden of equipment he carried. Sarah was already there, having moved her medical station to the shelter of the ancient building when Jake's warning came through. Tommy had repositioned his electronic monitoring gear to the monastery's bell tower, where he could maintain communication while providing overwatch for the entire area. 6 vehicles on the main road, 2 helicopters inbound from the southeast, Tommy reported through their radio network. Configuration suggests military or paramilitary forces, probably 20 to 30 personnel total. Dan studied the monastery's layout, identifying defensive positions and escape routes while James unpacked equipment that looked far more sophisticated than anything a fugitive should have been able to acquire. The gear included military-grade communication devices, electronic warfare equipment, and weapons that were definitely not available through commercial channels. "James," Dan said, helping to set up a defensive perimeter, "where exactly did you get all this equipment?" James looked up from the laptop computer he was connecting to his communication array. "That's a long story. The short version is that I haven't been hiding for 23 years. I've been working." "Working for who?" "For anyone who was willing to pay for information about the mole," James replied grimly. "British intelligence, German BND, French DGSE, even the Israelis. They all wanted to know how their operations were being compromised, and I was in a position to help them connect the dots." Dan felt a cold realization settling in his stomach. "You've been operating as a freelance intelligence agent, selling information to foreign governments." "I've been tracking a traitor who has been getting American service members killed for 2 decades, James corrected. "And I've been doing it the only way I could, given that the official channels were compromised." The sound of helicopter rotors was growing louder, and Tommy's voice came through their radios with increasing urgency. "First helicopter is setting up an overwatch position on the ridge to the north. Second bird is deploying personnel about half a mile south of our position. Ground vehicles are establishing a perimeter around the village." James finished his setup and activated his laptop. The screen displayed a complex array of communication intercepts, financial records, and operational intelligence that painted a picture of corruption and betrayal spanning decades. "This is what I've been putting together," he said to Dan. "Financial transfers, communication intercepts, operational compromises, and personnel records that all point to the same source." Dan studied the screen, trying to process the magnitude of what he was seeing. Bank accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, communication intercepts showing coordination with hostile intelligence services, and operational information that had been sold to enemies of the United States for profits that totaled tens of millions of dollars over the years. "Who is it?" Dan asked. James typed a command, and a personnel file appeared on the screen. The photograph showed a man in his early 50s, wearing the uniform of a senior intelligence official. Dan recognized the face immediately, though it took him a moment to process the implications of what he was seeing. "Deputy Director Richard Hawthorne," James said quietly. "CIA, currently responsible for counterintelligence operations in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. He's been the mole since before Operation Nightfall, and he's been using his position to eliminate anyone who might expose him." Dan stared at the screen, trying to reconcile the image of a respected intelligence official with the evidence of betrayal laid out before him. Hawthorne had been present during the briefings for Operation Nightfall, had helped plan the mission that was supposed to expose the mole they had been hunting. The irony was almost overwhelming. "He's been hunting me for 23 years, James continued. "Every time I got close to gathering enough evidence to expose him, people around me started dying. Informants, intelligence officers, even civilians who had accidentally stumbled across information they shouldn't have seen." The conversation was interrupted by Jake's voice on the radio. "Ground team is moving up the hill toward our position. 12 personnel, military configuration, carrying automatic weapons and what looks like breaching equipment." Dan moved to a window that provided a view of the approach route and confirmed Jake's assessment. The advancing team was moving with the precision and coordination that indicated professional military training. They were using cover and concealment effectively, coordinating their movement with the helicopter overwatch, and carrying equipment that suggested they were prepared for a significant confrontation. "Sarah, what's our medical situation?" Dan asked. "Basic trauma supplies, enough for emergency treatment but not for extended care," she replied from her position covering the monastery's rear entrance. "If anyone takes a serious hit, we need to get them to a real medical facility within an hour or two." Tommy's voice came from the bell tower. "I'm intercepting their communications. They're speaking Russian, but the command structure sounds military. And they're referring to James by a code name that translates roughly to the asset." James looked up from his computer with an expression of grim satisfaction. "That confirms what I suspected. Hawthorne has been working with Russian intelligence to eliminate me." The hit team in Prague was just the beginning. Dan was running tactical calculations, trying to determine their options for surviving the next few minutes. The monastery's stone walls would provide good protection against small arms fire, but they wouldn't stop dedicated attackers with the right equipment and sufficient motivation. And, with helicopter support, the attacking team could maintain pressure from multiple directions while preventing any attempt at escape. "What's on that computer?" Dan asked James. "Is it worth dying for?" James met his gaze steadily. "It's everything I've gathered over 23 years of investigation. Financial records, communication intercepts, operational details, and a complete picture of how Hawthorne has been betraying American operations. It's enough to expose him and everyone he's been working with. And if we don't make it out of here? Then, Hawthorne continues operating, more American service members die, and the Russians continue to receive classified intelligence about our operations worldwide." The first shots came without warning, high-velocity rounds that struck the monastery's stone walls with explosive force. Dan dropped to the floor and crawled to a position where he could return fire while staying under cover. The attacking team was advancing in coordinated bounds, using suppressive fire to pin down the defenders while maneuvering for better positions. "Tommy, what's the helicopter doing?" Dan called out. "Overwatch position, providing fire support for the ground team," Tommy replied. "And I'm picking up radio chatter about additional assets inbound." Looks like they're planning to overwhelm us with superior numbers. James was still working on his computer, frantically uploading files to secure servers while the battle raged around him. I need 5 more minutes to complete the data transfer, he called out to Dan. We might not have 5 minutes, Dan replied, returning fire at a figure who was trying to advance to a position closer to the monastery's main entrance. Sarah's voice came from the rear of the building, movement on the backside. At least 4 personnel trying to establish a flanking position. Dan made a tactical decision that he hoped wouldn't get them all killed. Jake, can you delay their advance long enough for James to complete his upload? I can try, Jake replied. But I'm going to need covering fire and maybe a distraction. Tommy, what kind of electronic warfare capabilities do you have available? Nothing that will stop a helicopter, Tommy replied. But I might be able to disrupt their radio communications for a few minutes. Dan looked at James, who was still typing frantically on his laptop. How much longer? 3 minutes, maybe 4. Do it, Dan told Tommy. Disrupt their communications. Jake, when their radios go down, move to delay the flanking team. Sarah, be ready to provide medical support for casualties. Tommy activated his electronic warfare equipment, and, within seconds, the volume of incoming fire decreased noticeably as the attacking team lost coordination. Jake took advantage of the confusion to move to a position where he could engage the flanking team, using the monastery's ancient architecture to provide cover while he maneuvered. But Dan knew that their advantage was temporary. Professional military teams trained to operate without radio communication, and it wouldn't take long for the attackers to adapt to the electronic disruption. They needed to complete James's data transfer and escape before the enemy could reorganize their assault. The answer came from an unexpected direction when Tommy called out from the bell tower, aircraft inbound from the west. Military configuration, but the radio chatter sounds American. Dan felt a surge of hope mixed with concern. If American assets were responding to the situation, it might mean that Admiral Steele had found a way to provide support. But it might also mean that they were about to be caught in the middle of an international incident that could have serious diplomatic consequences. James, how much longer? Dan called out. Upload complete, James replied, closing his laptop and securing it in a waterproof case. But, Dan, there's something else you need to know. The data I just uploaded includes evidence that Hawthorne has been planning to eliminate Admiral Steele. Marcus is in danger. Dan felt everything click into place. The reason James had reached out now, the reason he was willing to risk exposure after 23 years of hiding, wasn't just to clear his own name or expose a traitor. It was to save the life of a man who had been like a father to both of them. Then, we get out of here and we warn him, Dan said. The incoming American aircraft turned out to be a single helicopter carrying a small team of operators whose mission was officially classified but whose presence suggested that someone in the Pentagon had decided that James Sullivan's intelligence was worth the risk of an international incident. The firefight that followed was brief but intense, ending when the Russian-backed assault team realized they were outnumbered and outgunned. As they lifted off from the monastery in the American helicopter, Dan looked down at the ancient building that had sheltered them during the most dangerous few hours of their lives. The stone walls bore new scars from the battle, but they had held firm against an assault that could have ended with all of them dead. James sat across from him in the helicopter's cabin, clutching the waterproof case that contained 23 years of investigation into betrayal and corruption at the highest levels of American intelligence. His mission was finally complete, but Dan suspected that the most dangerous part of their journey was still ahead of them. Because now they had to convince the American government that one of its most trusted intelligence officials was a traitor, while staying alive long enough to ensure that the evidence reached people who could act on it. And, somewhere in Washington, D.C., Deputy Director Richard Hawthorne was preparing to eliminate the one man who could expose his decades of betrayal. The Iron Ghost was finally coming home, but Admiral Marcus Steele was running out of time. The secure facility outside Quantico had been built during the Cold War to house intelligence operations that were too sensitive for normal government buildings. Officially, it didn't exist. The maps showed only forest land owned by the Department of Agriculture, and the access roads were maintained by a private contractor whose employees had security clearances higher than most cabinet officials. It was here, in a conference room 3 levels underground, that James Sullivan sat across from a panel of officials whose combined authority could reshape American intelligence operations with a single decision. The room's occupants included the Director of National Intelligence, the Deputy Director of the CIA, a representative from the National Security Agency, and Admiral Marcus Steele, whose presence provided the only familiar face in a gathering that would determine whether James's 23 years of investigation would result in justice or cover-up. James had spent the past 72 hours being debriefed by teams of analysts who had examined every piece of evidence he had collected, every financial record he had uncovered, and every operational detail he had documented. The picture that emerged was more damaging than even James had fully understood. Deputy Director Richard Hawthorne's betrayal wasn't limited to selling classified information to Russian intelligence. He had been actively orchestrating operations designed to eliminate American assets, compromise ongoing missions, and position himself as an indispensable source of intelligence about American capabilities. "The financial evidence alone is overwhelming," said Director Catherine Morrison, the DNI whose reputation for integrity had survived 3 different administrations. Swiss bank accounts, cryptocurrency transactions, property purchases in countries that don't have extradition treaties with the United States. Deputy Director Hawthorne has received over $40 million in payments from sources that can be traced back to Russian intelligence services. The CIA's Deputy Director, Thomas Walsh, was studying a tablet that displayed communication intercepts James had gathered over the years. These encrypted messages show coordination of operations that resulted in the deaths of at least 12 American intelligence officers. If this evidence is accurate, Hawthorne is responsible for the most damaging intelligence betrayal since Aldrich Ames. James leaned forward in his chair, his voice carrying the weight of decades of careful investigation. "It's worse than Ames because Hawthorne has been operating from a position of significant authority. He hasn't just been passing along secrets he happened to have access to. He's been actively shaping operations to maximize the damage to American interests while minimizing suspicion about his own activities." Admiral Steele spoke for the first time since the briefing began. "James, walk us through Operation Nightfall again. Help us understand how Hawthorne managed to orchestrate your apparent death while maintaining his cover." James activated a presentation display that showed maps, personnel records, and operational timelines from the mission that had changed all of their lives. "Hawthorne was part of the planning committee for Nightfall. He knew our objectives, our routes, and our communication protocols. When we got close to identifying him as the source of intelligence leaks, he arranged for the mission to be compromised." The images on the display showed the compound in Afghanistan where Operation Nightfall had reached its climax. The Taliban fighters who attacked us weren't responding to routine intelligence gathering. They were waiting for us, with detailed information about our approach routes and tactical plans. Hawthorne had set us up to be eliminated. "But you survived," Director Morrison observed. "Barely. And only because I had prepared for the possibility of betrayal." James switched to photographs of the battle scene. "When I realized we were being set up, I staged my own death using a body from one of the Taliban fighters we had killed. The explosion that was supposed to eliminate evidence of the attack also covered my escape." Deputy Director Walsh looked troubled. "You're saying you allowed us to believe you were dead, allowed your family to grieve for you, for over 2 decades? "I'm saying I made the only choice that would allow me to stay alive long enough to gather evidence against the person who was getting American service members killed," James replied firmly. "If I had tried to report Hawthorne through official channels, I would have ended up dead within weeks, and he would have continued his activities undetected." Admiral Steele studied the evidence displays with the focused attention he had brought to countless operational briefings. "James, your investigation shows that Hawthorne has been involved in compromising operations across multiple theaters and time periods. How confident are you that this evidence would stand up in court?" "Completely confident," James replied. "I've spent 23 years being careful about documentation, verification, and chain of custody. Every piece of evidence can be authenticated, and much of it has been corroborated by foreign intelligence services who were also investigating how their joint operations with the United States were being compromised." The NSA representative, a woman whose name was classified even in this setting, spoke quietly. Mr. Sullivan, our analysis of the communication intercepts you provided shows patterns that extend beyond Russian intelligence services. Hawthorne appears to have been selling information to Chinese, Iranian, and North Korean services as well. James nodded grimly. Hawthorne's motivation wasn't ideological. It was purely financial. He sold information to whoever was willing to pay the highest price, regardless of the consequences for American security or the lives of service members. Director Morrison leaned back in her chair, considering the implications of what she had heard. If we proceed with prosecution based on this evidence, it will be one of the most damaging intelligence scandals in American history. The revelation that a senior CIA official has been operating as a foreign asset for over 2 decades will severely damage confidence in our intelligence community. The alternative is allowing him to continue operating, Admiral Steele pointed out. And, based on James's intelligence, Hawthorne has been planning to eliminate people who might pose a threat to his position. That includes me. The room fell silent as the officials processed the magnitude of the situation they were facing. They had definitive proof that a senior intelligence official had been betraying American operations for decades, but prosecuting him would expose weaknesses in security procedures and damage relationships with allied intelligence services who might question America's ability to protect sensitive information. Deputy Director Walsh broke the silence. There's another complication. Hawthorne is currently in charge of a counterintelligence operation that's investigating suspected penetration of CIA operations in Eastern Europe. If we arrest him without careful preparation, it could compromise ongoing investigations and put intelligence officers at risk. James pulled out a secure tablet and activated a real-time intelligence feed. That's not the biggest problem we're facing. My sources indicate that Hawthorne has become aware of my survival and of this investigation. He's preparing to disappear, probably within the next 48 hours. The intelligence feed showed financial activity in accounts linked to Hawthorne, including large transfers to banks in countries without extradition treaties. Travel arrangements were being made through intermediaries, and communication patterns suggested coordination with handlers who could provide safe passage to locations where American law enforcement couldn't reach him. If Hawthorne escapes, James continued, he takes with him detailed knowledge of American intelligence capabilities, ongoing operations, and the identities of intelligence officers operating under deep cover worldwide. The damage could continue for years. Admiral Steele stood up and moved to the display showing Hawthorne's escape preparations. Then, we don't let him escape. Director Morrison, what kind of operational authority do we need to detain Hawthorne and secure the intelligence he's been compromising? Director Morrison was quiet for a long moment, weighing legal requirements against operational necessities. Technically, we need approval from the Attorney General and coordination with the FBI. Practically, if Hawthorne really is preparing to flee within 48 hours, we don't have time for normal procedures. Then, we use extraordinary procedures, Admiral Steele said firmly. James has risked his life for 23 years to gather this evidence. American service members have died because of Hawthorne's betrayal. We don't let him escape to continue his activities from a location where we can't reach him. The NSA representative activated her own secure communication device. I can coordinate with FBI counterintelligence to establish surveillance and prepare for detention. But we need to move quickly and quietly. If Hawthorne realizes he's being investigated, he could accelerate his escape timeline. Deputy Director Walsh looked around the room, seeking consensus for a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Are we all in agreement that the evidence justifies immediate action? The officials nodded, each understanding that they were authorizing an operation that would challenge standard procedures but was necessary to prevent a catastrophic intelligence failure. Director Morrison stood up, her voice carrying the authority of her office. Admiral Steele, I'm authorizing you to coordinate with FBI counterintelligence to detain Deputy Director Hawthorne and secure any intelligence materials in his possession. Mr. Sullivan, you'll be placed in protective custody until we can assess the full extent of Hawthorne's network and eliminate any remaining threats. James shook his head firmly. With respect, Director Morrison, I've been protecting myself for 23 years. I'm not hiding now when we're finally in a position to bring Hawthorne to justice. James, Admiral Steele said, This isn't about hiding. It's about making sure you stay alive long enough to testify against Hawthorne and anyone else who was involved in his activities. Then, I stay alive, James replied. But, I'm not going into protective custody while Hawthorne is still free. I've earned the right to see this through to the end. The operation to arrest Deputy Director Richard Hawthorne took place the following morning at his home in McLean, Virginia. FBI agents, supported by a team of Navy SEALs operating under Admiral Steele's authority, surrounded the property at dawn and executed a carefully planned detention that prevented any opportunity for escape or the destruction of evidence. Hawthorne's reaction to his arrest provided the final confirmation of his guilt. Instead of protesting his innocence or demanding legal representation, he immediately began negotiating for a plea agreement that would provide him with protection in exchange for information about other intelligence officers who might be operating as foreign assets. The investigation that followed Hawthorne's arrest revealed a network of corruption that extended far beyond what James had been able to document during his years of careful investigation. Additional CIA officers, defense contractors, and even some military personnel had been compromised, either through financial incentives or blackmail. The damage to American intelligence operations was extensive, but the exposure of the network also provided opportunities to repair compromised operations and strengthen security procedures. For James Sullivan, the end of his 23-year investigation marked the beginning of a new phase of life that he had never allowed himself to imagine. The Navy offered him the opportunity to resume active duty with full recognition of his service and a promotion to reflect the years he had spent in unofficial operations. The CIA offered him a senior position in counterintelligence, where his experience in tracking foreign penetration could be invaluable in preventing future betrayals. But James chose a different path. He accepted a position as a consultant to the intelligence community, working to develop new procedures for detecting and preventing the kind of long-term penetration that Hawthorne had represented. It was work that drew on everything he had learned during his years as a ghost, but it also allowed him to operate in the open, with official support and recognition. Admiral Marcus Steele attended the classified ceremony where James was formally recognized for his service to the United States. As they stood together afterward, both men reflected on the cost of the decisions they had made decades earlier and the friendship that had survived betrayal, separation, and the kind of danger that tested the limits of human endurance. "Do you ever regret it?" Admiral Steele asked. "The 23 years you lost, the life you could have had?" James was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I regret the necessity of it. I regret that Hawthorne's betrayal made it necessary. But I don't regret the choice itself. Some things are worth any sacrifice, and protecting the people who serve this country is one of them." The Iron Ghost had finally come home, bringing with him the truth about betrayal and the proof that some ghosts return not to haunt the living, but to protect them from the shadows that others create. And, in the classified halls where America's most sensitive operations are planned and executed, James Sullivan's story became a reminder that loyalty, courage, and determination can survive even the deepest darkness. The war against those who would betray America's trust would continue, but it would be fought by people who understood that the price of freedom is constant vigilance, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are those whose names can never be spoken aloud. The Iron Ghost had done his duty, and, in doing so, he had ensured that others could continue to do theirs.